researched international mobility of personnel for the last couple of decades, focusing on Finland in general, but Europe and across the world, these countries here. Especially these days, I'm very intrigued by the notion of network analysis, and our latest study, a 6-country comparative study that we published last year, was one of the first comparative analyses that used social network analysis to try to get to the bottom or to see some new insights that we couldn't see before from social network analysis of academic networks. Okay, so anyway, I need to limit the scope and do some qualification before I start. Mainly, I'm interested in the intersections of migration, mobilities, and internationalization of personnel. I made this decision around 20 years ago when I had an epiphany that the thing is, in higher education institutions, ministries, and government agencies, if you get personnel right, so then everything is possible, especially new ideas are really literally anything's possible. If you get the personnel wrong, you get 1 year of internationalization, the same year repeated 20, 30 times. This is no problem to go to any of these countries in the globe and find 1 year repeated 20 times versus 20 years of experiential learning in a given field or in a given setting in a research team. I'm especially interested when we look at the personnel in higher education institutions, government ministries, and agencies, what happens across societies as a result of their actions. What's really important, most of these remarks are based on, I have to draw the distinction between the published studies of my colleagues and I, research in progress, brand new hypotheses based on our latest published research, and very many ongoing, very dynamic discussions, some of which I'll get into in a minute. I also draw the distinction, my scholarship, it's not focused on students, exports, transnational provision, almost any of these things. I'm interested in students to the extent when they become academic staff, when they go from getting their master's degree to entering our Finnish 4-stage research career system, doctoral student, postdoc, independent researcher, professor. So then I become very interested in what happens with and to students in different fields of study. Internationalization is simple, but it's not easy. But basically, I'm not saying, I'm not trying to be facetious or anything, but it's different than selling it, branding it, or packaging it. Although, with respect to everybody who's talked here before, these things are really important, and in Finnish higher education, to be fair, I think we've done kind of a mediocre to lousy job at this during the past 2 decades or so when I've been studying higher education research in Finland and in comparative research. But basically, when I start looking as a higher education researcher, especially when I'm doing comparative research, I'm always interested in a certain tension. Top-down vision and steering at the regional, national level, universities and universities of applied sciences, faculties, colleges, institutes. These are all really interesting focal points. But what I really dive into, my colleagues and I and my team, what we're really interested in, what happens in departments, in units, in research teams, research groups or programs, and with individual scholars. So basically, that's a long-winded way of saying, basically, I'm interested in the tension between what you all think you're doing and what you're actually doing. And this is nothing new in social sciences, but to me, when you actually get into contrasting what happens in different departments, units, across disciplines, so you get into some pretty interesting differences. The hazards of, in some ways, I'm absolutely the wrong person to ask to a launch event of a new program. So there's hazards. I'm always walking a tightrope when I come into an audience like this, because I can tell you the reasons empirically and theoretically why it is a really good idea for some people who are someplace else, why they should relocate here. If they're already here, I can tell you with empirical and theoretical clarity why they should continue the next phase of their career. And I can also tell you, based on wherever it is you come from, why you should avoid here, forget about it, or if you're here, leave as quickly as possible for the next stage of your career. This is not, especially the more we understand about network logic, the more we understand that leaving is not necessarily a tragedy or a bad thing, because especially if you go and do a postdoc in one place, your doctoral student in another place, end up as a professor in another place, that's generally a good thing, especially if it's been a series of good experiences. But it can also be quite the opposite. It's very easy to run around to our higher education institutions and find people pretty stuck and in pretty desperate circumstances that are wondering how in the world did I get in this mess, and how to avoid that is a good thing. And an important thing, if there's something unique about what it is my colleagues and I have recently done, especially comparatively speaking, is in the context of Finnish higher education. I'm talking about Finnish-born, Finnish scholars of Finnish parents who grew up here. I'm talking about Finnish scholars of migrant background, which we are seeing in some fields of sciences, which we are not seeing in others. And I'm also talking about people from the international global labor market and the very interesting differences we have between these. The only interesting theoretical approach, things like that, or empirical realities are things where you can talk about these people who mix together in very complex ways within our higher education institutions in the same breath. You need to understand really what are the key relationships to have in focus here. I'm not going to bore you with the science. I think people have very weird ideas and stereotypes about what it is social science and policy analysts like me do in real life. If you Google scholar, scientists, and nerds, you get a bunch of pictures like this. So if somebody wants to talk about the science of this, I'm happy to over a coffee after this is done. Right now, I'm not going to go into it. I think some of the personal and more practical insights that we gain from our research, from my colleagues and I, they're much more valuable. What I get into these conversations with people, not only in Finland, but in plenty of countries, where we end up having a heart-to-heart about professionally and personally. This is, I echo Professor Small here, that you have to understand the difference between somebody's personal life and their professional life, and especially their family. Your best days are ahead of you if you relocate here, stay here, avoid here, or leave here. And that's a very hard set of discussions to have with some people, but all of us have them, especially anybody in here who's mobile and has spent time being mobile knows you come to these certain points where you have to decide, sometimes as an individual, sometimes you and your spouse as your family, what are we going to do here? What's our next move? My career, our kids' possibilities. The key dimensions, the answer, the organizer's question, she sent me this really interesting title, that Are We Dreaming of Truly, Genuinely Internationalization? There's two key dimensions I look at now these days if I go out and on a new study or something like that. I'm especially interested in Finland's 4-stage research career stage. Doctoral student, postdoc, independent researcher, professor. Who's going through that? Who's not? And the differences between who is and who isn't. And where internationalization of personnel, especially at stage 3 and 4, again echoing Professor Small, when you're talking about group leaders and professors, where it is needed, where it is not needed, where the unit staff are aware why this is the case, where the unit staff are completely unaware why this is the case. This gives you 4 different sets of departments you're looking at. And all these remarks, this is not confined to Finnish higher education. There's a lot of similarities across the Nordic countries, and especially in mainland Europe, a lot of this stuff generally holds true. So basically, the answer to the question Tina sent me, are we dreaming of genuinely international higher education research? When I first heard that question, I thought, interesting question. Only problem is there's 3 answers to this question, at least. There's 4, I guess. So in world-class settings, the answer is no, you're not dreaming. There's world-class settings in this country that go back 20, 30 years. And these people are the best in the world at what they do. There's nobody better. There's people as good. And and they're scattered around the globe. The competition, they know all of them scattered around, but the thing is, there's no big dream, and these people have existed a long time, and they are one of our most formidable attractions here. And this is long established practice, and they are very well aware of what they need in terms of their internationalization. But when you get down to your, like what we use a football analogy, world-class national champions, local heroes, when you get to your nationally significant programs, there's two answers I could give you. You're not necessarily dreaming where the internationalization of personnel, especially at stage 3 and 4, is needed, and unit staff is aware of this, improving over time, but experiencing challenges. So anyway, this is a pretty healthy starting point, especially for the kind of initiative you all are launching here today. But there's another setting where the internationalization of personnel, especially at stage 3 and 4, again echoing Professor Small, it's the biggest key indicator I can get when I'm doing a purposeful selection of a country comparison or international comparison is, do I see professors and deans, unit heads, people in the strategic management unit? If not, I become very aware, okay, this is the kind of place I'm dealing with. And where the internationalization of personnel at these levels is needed and the staff is unaware why this is the case, they need new international staff. Going back to the speaker from Beijing earlier, it's about new ideas, it's about different voices at the table, it's about speaking critically and challenging assumptions. The one thing we found out in our international comparative studies, there is no such thing as a safe assumption. You can't assume that what we're going to sell here is going to sell anywhere, and we're much too uncritical about what we accept from other places. Again, local heroes tied in when you're talking about programs, higher education institutions that have an extremely local focus. Again, you get into a lot of areas where internationalization is interesting, but it's fairly optional depending if your son or daughter is training to be an accountant or something like this. Maybe it's nice but not needed, but with the caution that the moment they get their degree, they're probably going to meet somebody from another country, and then all of a sudden all of these things become very real if they become, like Professor Small said, a trailing spouse. So there's these different answers to these questions that is important, and this is very paradoxical about personnel. The real paradox here is in many settings we need migrant or mobile personnel far more than they need us. There's countries, continents, companies, and communities that understand this way better than we do. The thing is, the red carpet is rolled out for talent, and if they're any good, there has to be another reason for them to stay here. It's not going to be because they can't get a better salary, especially if they're really talented, or better conditions. There are the things we can give them, quality of life-wise, but it's different. So the big paradox here, where migrant talent is absent in key settings, we need to be far more critical and honest about understanding why that is and act on it, and especially in these settings where the personnel we need the most are the least likely to be recruited, selected, promoted, and retained. That's the paradox. These are both true statements. We need them a lot more than they need us, and the places we need them the most, they are the least likely people to go through the pipeline. And so empirically this is becoming very clear. Observations going forward. This is again what the speaker from Beijing said. The personnel and their ideas are the most powerful leverage I've found as a focus in my own research and the research my colleagues and I do. It's personnel who run the place. Students are interesting, but personnel run the place, and it's on us to change things. It's kind of rare to meet host nationals who really get what's entailed in committing to the next stage of their career in 24/7, 365 days a year in a different system, university and setting, using multiple languages. Of course, some people do get this in some way. Maybe they've had an exchange period in high school or something like that. But I would respectfully point out, often very few people understand what it's like to integrate as a migrant in this country. This country is very challenging in some ways, especially depending where you're from. It's for somebody, I won't say names or anything. For some people, it's no problem. Some people, it's challenging. When reading visions, it's easy to imagine the lack of critical thinking grounded in empirical realities. I say this with all due respect, but you have to start with bold visions and wanting to go do this, making good networks. But if you don't know the empirical realities, what you're actually facing in the departments where this stuff actually needs to work, it's limited to what you can do. National level settings, along with strategic management in higher education institutions, offers a potential leverage point. My team and I are looking a lot harder. It used to be conventionally, okay, let's look at the professors, the doctoral students, the postdocs, etc. But now we're also looking, like Professor Small said that who's in your strategic development unit? Who's your rector? Who are the deans in this place? This tells us something, and potentially very much more leverage. So I think it comes down to visions and slogans that you do need versus critical questions, analysis, and conversations. The hardest conversations I have are with talented personnel who want to stay and advance, but understand already themselves that this is not going to happen in this particular department. They're very clear about that. And this is something that needs to change, especially in those settings where we really need to hold on to those people, where we need their very new voices. It's even more complicated, like I just said this, when we really need their talent, critical insights, and voice in the settings where it's missing. This is absolute necessity in some fields of studies, not others. This is most complicated when families, and you can easily, it's not very hard to find one family member, one spouse who has a clear way forward in our system, and even an attractive way forward, a solid career path, with the other spouse perhaps being pushed in a different direction outside the country. A lot of people try to make that work, but it's really, I mean, this is not, again, limited to Finnish higher education. This is something that my colleagues and I, we bump into all the time. We live it. These kinds of realities. So this is what we're up against. Okay, and I'll leave you with this. It's not a conclusion. This is what I ask new doctoral students, postdocs, even interns or master's degree students when they want to come to one of the two groups I'm leading right now. I ask them this question. If they can answer it, if they can give me a decent answer, the conversation will continue. If they're uncritical, I don't have time. I'm sure they're nice people and things like that, but we really need a lot more critical thinking. We need to know to question our unquestioned assumptions a lot better than we do right now. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that these are very important questions and thoughts that we have to take into account when we are starting the work of the forum.